I was born in 1925 in December. Turned out to be Pearl Harbor later, but 7th of December. I grew up, of course, during the Depression years. My father worked for the state of Illinois there at the last portion of the Depression years, doing heavy equipment for the drainage ditches in Illinois. Shortly before the war started, or before the United States got in the war, he was moved from the Illinois into the federal service and became head of the construction at Chanute Air Force Base, or Chanute Field we called it back then, and now Rantoul, Illinois. I went to school, and as a result of Dad moving around the state so much, I went to school in about 3 different grade schools and 5 high schools before I got out of school. The last place where I graduated was Potomac, Illinois, a very small town about 100 miles south of Chicago. In November of '43, the federal government had the schools at a volunteer basis take a one-day test. Well, it turned out this is essentially the same test as the AGCT test that all draftees took when they went into the service. It consisted of about a dozen or so subjects, including Morse code, physics, English, a little bit of everything. Apparently I scored fairly high with that. When I graduated in May of '43, I'm sorry. Yeah, May of '43, I got a job as a delivery boy at Chanute Field. And so I was running around the field delivering mail to the squadrons on a little 3-wheeled motor scooter. And I took time off one day to go over to headquarters at Chanute Field and enlisted. I was only 17 at the time, but I had my parents' permission, so that was permitted. Since I was one of the few people enlisting rather than being drafted, the general insisted upon swearing us in. So I went up to the general's office one morning, I think that was the 6th of July, and got sworn into the Army. Went back to driving my little motor scooter, and the Army didn't know what to do with me. And the upshot of this was that I did not go into the Air Force, which is what I had anticipated. I got orders to go to University of Kansas and ASTP. So I was in the ASTP from July, I think we got there about the 2nd or 3rd week of July, until the end of the year. So I took 2 semesters, or 2 terms they called it in the ASTP, and without a shadow of a doubt, that was the worst period I had in my Army career. It was an impossible schedule we were on. The semesters or the terms were 3 months, and very difficult to keep up with the classes. It was a very concentrated course. The intent was to graduate us in 2 years, and the upshot was we were to become second lieutenants in the engineering corps at termination of this. Well, it didn't happen. Eisenhower came back from Europe about that time and said we need about 5 more infantry divisions. So they wiped out the ASTP and made a whole bunch of infantry divisions out of the people that were in school at that time. So in Christmas of '43, we were confined to quarters, didn't understand why. They canceled the ASTP at University of Kansas, although I understand some of the other campuses continued to go after that. Kansas stopped at that point in time, and we were reported to a reinduction at, I can't remember the name of the base now, at a fort there in Kansas, and went through an induction process. We had to turn in the uniforms we had on the campus and draw out new uniforms, and I served KP for about 7 days during that time. And then on the trip from there to Fort McClellan, Alabama, took about 3 days on a troop train. I was on KP on the troop train. I got off in Fort McClellan. I think we got off the train about 10 or 11 o'clock at night, and we were herded into an area in some hutments in a mortar battalion at Fort McClelland. And before they fell us out, the sergeant said, "You better check the bulletin board to see whether you're on duty the next day." Sure enough, I was on KP. So that was a stretch of almost 2 weeks in a row that I was on KP. Well, what I didn't know was the Army was trying to keep track of me. My mother had passed away while I was on this troop train, so the company commander had put me on KP to keep me close to headquarters in case I was the right Robert Hall. And there must have been a jillion Robert Halls in the Army at that time. So the upshot of this was that I got an emergency furlough, went back for about a week and a half, and was there for they'd held up the funeral. And so my oldest brother, who was in the Air Corps in Biloxi, Mississippi at that time, and my oldest brother was in Kansas, I believe, in the Signal Corps, and the middle brother was in the Air Corps in Biloxi, Mississippi. And so the three of us were there for our mother's funeral. And then after I returned to McClelland, they had reassessed my record in some fashion. So I ended up going to the 5th Regiment, which is the communications. And so I went into a real easy time. Compared to the ASTP, this was infantry basic training was simple. You know, we had basic infantry training and same training most privates went through in those days. But in addition to that, we had pole climbing, message center. We had to learn to encrypt messages in the M209 converter, take code up to 15 words a minute, and operate all of the radios that the infantry had at that time. And so after basic training, I was a communications guy. Well, at the end of that period, almost everybody was shipped out except myself. In the meantime, the Congress had passed this business that no man could go overseas as a replacement under the age of 19. And of course I was not 19 yet, since I'd gone in at 17. So consequently, I could not go overseas as a replacement. I could go overseas as a member of an organization, but not as a replacement. So to kill time for me, they sent me to they sent me to radio repair school at Fort Benning. So I went through a radio repair school and learned to repair all the radios that the Signal Corps provided to the infantry. This is an infantry school, not a Signal Corps school. At the end of that time, I still wasn't old enough to go overseas as a replacement, so they sent me to a outfit called the 70th Infantry Division, which was being moved at that time from Camp Adair down to Fort Leonard Wood. So I ended up at Leonard Wood in the latter part of July of '44, before the outfit had gotten there, and I was the only private, so naturally I ended up on KP for 2 weeks waiting for the rest of the hour. I was the only private, you know.
I'm gonna stop you right there for a second. I'm gonna backtrack. I've asked the other guys that I've interviewed so far, and I'm sure you remember where you were when you heard about Pearl Harbor.
Oh. In Pearl Harbor, I was in high school, and that was my birthday. And some friends of my parents had shown up, and we had a little birthday cake at lunch, and they had to drive. They were from a town about 25 or 30 miles away, so they had to drive home in the middle of the afternoon. There's a Sunday course. So they were leaving, and my parents were standing by their car talking, and I had turned the radio on, and I heard this news of Pearl Harbor. And so I ran out the back door and told all four of them, these adults, that there was an attack on Pearl Harbor by the Japanese. Word was on the radio, and they all trooped into the house and listened to the thing. That evening, I was singing in a church choir at that time, and that evening I went into the choir area of our church, and I told the other guys and other people, both boys and girls, that we were at war, you know, or essentially were because of the attack. And nobody believed me. Nobody had listened to the radio that day. So and it wasn't until yesterday, the next day at school, they trooped everybody in high school into this auditorium, and they turned on a radio and listened to the president's broadcast when he announced our entering the war.
Were you aware of the situation in Europe and in the Pacific, the events leading up to Pearl Harbor?
I think so. We were pretty well aware.
Did you think anything about it? I mean, did you say, okay, it's over there?
Well, as a matter of fact, I think I was conditioned at that time to knowing that I would be in the Army before, as soon as I graduated from high school. I think that was even before Pearl Harbor. I think I knew that. I already had one brother in the Air Corps at the time, and the other brother I thought was safe, would probably never go in because he was married and had a child at that time. So I was very surprised when he was drafted shortly after I went in as enlisted. He became drafted in the Signal Corps. But I think I was well aware that we were probably going to go to war.
Right. Did you have what were your aspirations while in high school? Did you have an idea, okay, this is what I want to do?
I wanted to go to college. I definitely wanted to become, even then, I think I wanted to become an engineer. I'm not positive. My primary interests were in reading, music, that sort of thing. But I was interested in mechanical things, and so I think I always wanted to be an engineer. And I had planned to go to college, but I did not know how I could afford to.
Right.
So when this ASDP opportunity came up, I thought that was, a benefit.
Right.
It was well worthwhile getting into because it would give me a college education essentially free.
Right.
Well, it didn't turn out that way.
You had to pay for it somehow, right?
Right.
I'm going to jump forward now. We're going to pick up, you're at Fort Leonard Wood, and you got KP. Describe your training there, the conditioning, and then and your unit eventually got word, okay, we're shipping out, guys. Let's get ready.
Yeah. When I first, I was very disappointed when I first got in there to find that I was in an A company, and I did not go into a communications organization of any kind. I became a scout in the first squad of the first platoon, being the first guy in the outfit, obviously, and the lowest letter and the lowest number, A company of 274. It was probably 2 weeks after I arrived that the rest of the company came down from Madeira, but even then it was very skinny. Many men had been pulled out, I think, to go to Pacific, so there were very few men in the ranks. There was a full cadre, and I believe there were 3 or 4 officers in the company at that time, and we had a full set of non-coms. Full, the kitchens well supplied with cooks and that sort of thing, but no dog faces. Well, I ended up as being first scout, and we went through pretty much the same thing I'd already gone through in basic training for a couple of 3 months, except that because of my background in communication, I would get pulled out for special duties occasionally as a radio operator or something of that sort. For example, there was one attack by 2 of the regiments on a 3rd regiment, and one regiment went on top of the hill there in Missouri and dug a bunch of foxholes, put up target silhouettes, and the other 2 regiments had artillery preparation and attacked that hill. It was an exercise that went through. During that one, our Lieutenant Beyer, was tapped as an umpire, and he in turn tapped me as his radio operator. So I was on the umpire's team during that exercise, for example. And so I had to dig a foxhole for the lieutenant, and we sat there all night comparing notes on college. And I got to know Lieutenant Beyer quite well that night. We got word that we were going to ship out sometime early November, I think, and we started packing up stuff. And that meant doing a lot of crates and that sort of thing. And we were in the process of doing that when I got called in, I think it was the 2nd week in November, and said, you're being transferred to regimental headquarters company. So it turned out that in the course of shuffling people around, they found out they were short some wiremen in regimental headquarters. So I got transferred to regimental headquarters as a wireman because I had had a communications background. and was used to climbing poles with irons and that sort of thing. I was rather disappointed because I preferred radio, I preferred to take code, but I really did not like leaving A Company because at that time, of course, I'd met all these fellows and I'd been in the barracks with them now for several months, and they were all buddies. And now I was going into a strange outfit. Well, the last week before we left Fort Leonard Wood, I was in a strange outfit with these guys packing up these things. But a rather interesting incident happened during that time. I was working with a crew building some crates, overseas crates, when a messenger came out and said the company commander wanted to see me. So I went into the company commander's office. My dad was standing there. Well, the company commander was confused. He was under the impression that my father wanted to get me married off or something. Turned out that when I was in high school, I'd known this couple. They were childless. That was a radio repairman and also handled all the telephone communications in this little hick town that we were in, where I went to high school. And so I used to hang around his shop repairing radios, and I went out with him several times to repair the telephone lines and that sort of thing. So I know him quite well and knew his wife only because she would say hello, and once in a while she'd bring coffee out to us or something. So I knew Edith slightly, and it turned out that what I didn't know was while I was in the Army, her husband had passed away, who I'd known, and of course my mother had passed away, and so my father was marrying this lady. And so Dad had managed to get, I don't know how, managed to get into Fort Leonard Wood and got to the company that I was in somehow or other, and had asked the company commander if I could go off while he and Edith got married. Well, put the company commander in the spot because we were not supposed to allow leave the post. So he finally had to get permission, I think, from division before they allowed me. But I did get a 3-hour pass, long enough to go to Rolla, Missouri, to be best man at my father's wedding, just before we shipped out. Okay, then we took a troop chain, and this time I did not pull KP. No, I don't understand why. But anyway, we took a troop chain to Camp Miles Standish, and then you've probably heard from many of the other guys in the 70th. We went overseas on the Mariposa, SS Mariposa, which had been a luxury liner. In the meantime, I was with a lot of guys I did not know, and I, for some reason or other, did not make good friends. They were a rather, I don't know, a strange bunch in that they didn't accept a stranger too well, and I didn't make a good friend while I was with our platoon of regimental headquarters. We ended up we got off the 48s. I
want to. Once you got into Marseille, you went up to CP2. Is that correct?
That's correct. We were.
What were the conditions like up there for the brief time you used?
It was so wet. The mud was probably a foot thick. The only dry place was the first sergeant had managed to get a log, and he had a little fire burning this log, and they played poker there all day. And I spent most of my time, I think, looking over this poker game. But it was rather miserable, and it was very difficult to sleep. We didn't sleep well at all because you're sleeping in the mud. You're constantly cold. We weren't really equipped for it. The overcoat that I had been the wrong size, and the supply sergeant take it away from me and was supposed to give me a new one, and never got there. We went overseas with a great deal of extra baggage. In my case, I wore a fairly small shoe size, and it was a rare one, so I took 4 sets of boots, and they took 3 of them away from me while we were at CP2, because that was a good way of getting boots over to the European continent. At any rate, we were there for, golly, I lost track of time, but I think it was 2 or 3 weeks before we were on the 48s, going up to Alsace-Lorraine area.
That train ride up, just so for people that don't know, the 48s, can you describe those for people that don't know what 48 means?
It was a very small engine pulling, I would guess, a dozen cars, perhaps more. These are very small cars. The French called them, we called them 40 because they were labeled 40 men or 8 horses. We had in our car, as I remember, well, there was a lot of straw on the floor of the thing for us to sleep on. We had, I think, 38 men. I'm not sure. I don't think we had the full 40. We were just slightly shy of that on board our particular car. We had one place where they'd scrape the straw away so we could get one little burner to cook on. We had 10-1 ration, which is the ration that was normally done for tank crews. And it was fairly decent food, but it required heating because the canned goods were, for example, a pound of bacon be rolled up and shoved in the can, and so you open both ends of the can and you shove the bacon out and unroll it and put that in a frying pan, cooked it. Well, it meant you had to have cooking facilities, and that's the reason why we had this small burner. Well, you can imagine cooking for about 40 people on one little teeny burner took forever to have a meal. So we had, I think I had enough food for 3 meals, but it took all day cooking. I mean, somebody was constantly cooking. You were constantly waiting to get food. Mm-hmm. We had a bucket for necessary needs. And unfortunately, the one book that I had fell into that bucket and it got thrown out, so I never finished that book.
As you got closer to the front and detraining, what were your thoughts as you realized, okay, we're heading into the real thing here, we're getting close?
I don't think I thought much about it from my personal standpoint, but I was concerned because there were 2 men on the thing, and one night we were chatting. These 2 men were both Jewish, and they were extremely concerned about being captured, that they would be maltreated by the Germans, and that really concerned me. And unfortunately, it's turned out that that was true, that many Jewish were maltreated when they were POWs. These particular 2 did not, because the regimental headquarters was sufficiently far back from the front line that very few regimental men, headquarters and headquarters company were involved in the direct action. Very few of them were captured. Those in the rifle companies, that isn't true. They were captured and many of them were maltreated. But that was my concern on that train ride, was listening to their stories. And in both cases, they had had a very severe youth, growing up in the Depression years with insufficient food to eat, and kind of sad story. I don't think I was concerned about myself at that particular point in time anyway, because regimental headquarters was, they were safe. That was rear echelon, no big problem. We weren't going into combat as far as we knew. It wasn't strictly true because many of the people in regimental headquarters were on wire detail close to the front, but regimental never got closer to the line than the battalion headquarters, which is usually 2 to 3 miles behind the line. So it was never as bad as in the rifle companies. At any rate, we got off of the troop train, and I don't remember the times, but it was after the sun had gotten quite low. In fact, I think the sun might have set at the time we got off. So we marched virtually all night. We got into this little town, started with a B, and I can't remember the name of it now.
Was it Brumath?
Yeah, in the middle of the night, or middle of morning, wee hours in the morning. And there was a factory, a small factory with a lot of glass in the ceiling, and that had been busted by artillery or bombing of some nature. Whatever it was, that glass had broken, so there's about a half a foot of glass all over the floor. And so that's where we bunked down that night, on that glass. And I was unrolling my blanket to try and get some sleep, and the sergeant came by and tapped me and says, "You're on duty for guarding the colonel." So I went over to this one building, which is the richest man in town, I guess. Had this one house that was surrounded by 4 streets, and I marched around that house for 2 hours on duty with an empty M1 because we didn't have any ammunition yet. I thought that was kind of a little silly. But at any rate, I pulled guard duty at the colonel's house for 2 hours, and I got back just in time to lay down, and somebody said chow, and so I think I got about 1 hour of sleep, and then I went out on a wire detail, and we started laying wires to the battalions. I continued with the wire detail all through that period from, that was Christmas Day, I believe, until Niederbronn. At Niederbronn we were, I was on the duty in the middle of the night when we pulled out of there. The 1st Battalion was supposed to be pulling their switchboards out at midnight. The 2nd Battalion was supposed to be pull theirs out at 1 a.m. and the 3rd Battalion at 2 a.m. or some arrangement like that. Well, in each case they did it early, and we were trapped because the switchboard operator would holler out to us, "Line's dead, 1st Battalion." Well, we'd start out tracing wires with our hands looking for a break in the wire because, well, it turned out we'd get to the end of the wire and that's where the 1st Battalion was, and they just dropped the wire when they disconnected the switchboard. And we report back, and, well, I'm sorry, the 2nd Battalion's out, so you'd pull the same thing. I found out they'd already pulled their switchboard out. So it wasn't a bad line in each case. It ended up, we got back after the 3rd of these incidents and found out that everybody had pulled back except us. So we started back on foot. By that time they'd loaded all of our stuff into the one truck we had left, so we started out walking, and I don't remember when it was, in the middle of the night sometime, we got a truck picked us up, and we carried us about an hour, and then he dumped us off. They were using these trucks to shuttle, and we're walking most of the time. We get a truck ride every so often. And we were half asleep walking that night. I remember at about dawn hearing this loud, thunderous noise. And it turned out that in the gray of dawn, and pre-dawn I guess it was, there was a Spitfire just on the other side of the trees that were on, and apparently this British outfit were there, and they had one plane that they couldn't get out, and of course the clouds were very low. There was very little flying done during that time, and so they were trying to get this plane out before the Germans came in and captured it. And so you could hear these guys running up the engine, and I think they tried to take it off. Whether they were successful or not, I have no idea. But that kind of woke me up hearing that sound. We finally got in this little French town, and I have no idea what its name was, but it turned out that rumor had it, somebody, I don't remember who, said that A Company was in the same town. So I approached our warrant officer, our wire chief, and asked if I could have some time off to go see if I could find my old buddies, and he allowed me to do so. And I finally found them in a barn, and Pat, my old the communications sergeant, was now acting first sergeant, and Pat was almost in tears. He had been making out the morning report and had counted noses and found that of the 212 men that we had when we got in the 40 and 8s, there were only 39 left in the company, enlisted men. Well, a lot of those came back. We didn't know that at the time. A lot of them were wounded. They were in aid stations and hospitals, and they did come back within the next couple of days. Or they kept coming back over a period of about a month. Mm-hmm. And I've talked to several of them since then who are wounded at Spickren. And I guess I'm lucky that I was in regimental headquarters because I didn't go through that Spickren thing. I was in Niederbronn during that time. At any rate, Pat convinced me that I should come back to the A Company. And so I went back to this warrant officer and I asked him permission to get a transfer. And he called me every kind of stupid fool there was in the world, which is probably true. But I did, he did allow me to transfer out of the wire section back to A Company. So I went back to E Company as acting communications sergeant, and up to this time, Pat had been carrying on his duties as acting first sergeant, as well as communications sergeant, because he had nobody to replace him that had any communications background, and so I took over as acting communications sergeant, and I was acting in that position until I finally made rank. I got sergeant in the latter part of February, I believe.
Was there an occasion where, as a communications sergeant, was there an occasion where you had to pick up your rifle and said, "We got some Germans"? Do you recall a time where you were involved in actual combat?
There are many times I hit the ground, and I fired my rifle, but it was only at command. I don't know that we were ever ambushed in such a fashion I had to do it in self-defense or anything. It was always a case where we were. I was operating a radio as a part of a combat patrol or something like that, and I would hit the ground and I would fire it along with everybody else. But I never had to protect myself, if you want to put it that way. It was always an offensive action, not a defensive.
As a communication sergeant, what was the most difficult part about your job? If you thought it was, if you think it's difficult, what was the hardest thing to handle under the pressure?
Just staying alive. No, I don't mean. That's kind of humorous. I didn't really mean it that way.
Oh, that's fine.
It was a fact that we were just surviving at the time. I think that was our main thought, was to survive this war, because guys were getting wounded and killed almost constantly, and so many of these deaths were I don't know how you'd say it. You felt defenseless because so many of them were artillery and not direct fire. We did get many killed as a result of direct fire from rifles and machine guns, and the Germans were quite good with their automatic weapons. And it was strange that under their circumstances they had so much ammunition, because they were constantly blasting. And so it's fairly easy for a man with very little training to just let a blast and just let the weapon travel across. It's bound to cut the enemy in two. So it's very easy for them, without a great deal of training, to be extremely good soldiers. Whereas we had to be a little more cautious. We only had a clip of a few rounds, and then we had to change clips. So we were a little bit less prepared that way. But what I was trying to portray was the fact that you never knew where you could get an artillery burst. Or more common than artillery probably was mortar fire. We were constantly in a mortar fire. And most of the Alsace-Lorraine area is wooded. We were constantly in trees and constantly had this tree burst problem. So you could dig a foxhole, which is safe from anybody that is looking for you to try to shoot you, but you're not safe from a tree burst. And I would say the biggest percentage of our people were killed by artillery fire or something of that nature.
And you remained as a communications sergeant all the way up through Saarbrücken?
That is correct.
That is correct.
Yes.
What's one thing that sticks in your mind over the course of combat until basically the 70th kind of went into occupation duty reserves prior to the end of the war? What was the one thing that sticks out in your mind during that period? Out of many.
Kind of difficult to answer that question. I don't really know that there is any one thing. Looking back on it, the one thing that bothered all of us was the lack of information. We never knew. You didn't know where the enemy was. You never knew what was needed. You didn't know what was happening on either side of you. You were constantly in doubt. We never. There was one period of time, and I can't remember exactly when it was, when the outfit on our right flank retreated. I don't think it was part of the 70th. I think it was a different outfit. We didn't know it, but our right flank was completely exposed. We didn't know that until somebody told us that. We had to swing back. But it was this constant feeling of not knowing. And The only part of the war that I really think I know anything about at all was, and I have to move forward a little bit to tell this story. After the 70th was busted up, I ended up going to the 29th Infantry. It was a organization which had no division, was attached to SHAEF. And several months after we had busted up the organization, a bunch of us got moved back into the Wiesbaden area, which is where we were when I was in A Company, 274. At any rate, in the coffee shop there, they had some fairly large tables, and a bunch of us were sitting at this table, 10 or 12 of us. And somebody across the table said something about Spickern Heights, and I replied something about Spickern Heights. And this German who was serving coffee to me kind of stiffened and disappeared, and he came back a little while with another waiter who spoke a little bit of English. And this other fellow said, would you mind coming to the kitchen? And so I apologized to the guys I was with. There were various different outfits, Air Force and a little bit of everything at the table. There were only a couple of us that had been in the 70th. At any rate, I went to the kitchen, and for an hour, with this other fellow interpreting, we refought that battle. He had been the, what we would call a first sergeant, I think a sergeant major or equivalent in Luftwaffe. I'm sorry, Luftwaffe, Wehrmacht.
Yeah.
And on Spickern Heights, opposite our company. So we refought that war in the kitchen through this interpreter, and he was telling me what was happening to them at the same time it was happening. And if his story is true, his Wehrmacht outfit had 6 SS men behind them. Their foxholes were sufficiently far behind them that if any one of the Wehrmacht tried to run away, the SS would shoot them. And they knew that they had a bullet to their back, so they had to stay there. And it was the last day that they retreated back toward the Saar. There was a heavy fog that morning, and he had gotten up and under the cover of the fog had gone back on the excuse of looking for their chow wagon that was supposed to come up with breakfast before dawn, and found that the SS holes were empty. So he quickly came back and got all of the guys in his Wehrmacht organization. By that time, all their officers were killed, and he was the ranking person in his organization. And he got all these guys out of the hole, and they started moving back. Well, the SS was waiting for them about a mile back, and they had to dig in again and prepare defenses. But at any rate, I remember that equivalent morning, we were under this fog, didn't know the Germans were gone. And it wasn't until one of our guys crawled forward and found an empty foxhole, came back, says, the Germans are gone. And of course, the battalion had to send out a combat patrol. Well, Georgia, one of our guys that got a field commission at that time, had a combat patrol, and he only had about a dozen or so guys left, able-bodied men left in his 3rd platoon, so he had to borrow some guys from Durgan in the 1st platoon in order to make up a combat patrol of 20 or 30 guys. And so I carried the radio while we went out looking for the Germans. And of course we found them finally where they dug in. So here we are sitting in this kitchen comparing notes about all of this. It was kind of interesting. So it's one of the few places in the war that I can remember anything about, because I got the other side's story a little bit on that one.
You're on occupation duty.
Yes.
After you, the 70th is taken to SAR, they got cut off by the juncture. What was duty like during that portion before the war ended, and you guys weren't
that was heaven. For a short while, I was town commander of a little town called Johannesburg. Johannesburg is on a high portion overlooking the Rhine River. Bingen is down below on the river, Rudesheim. At any rate, the Mumm family at that time, I think the Mumm were originally French, but they had acquired vineyards in both France and Germany, and had built this home back in the 20s, and it was like a 30 room mansion. And so I had my little section of 10 or 12 guys in this great big mansion with this private swimming pool and the whole thing. Well, Pat, the first sergeant, had been a buyer of some sort for one of the major stores back before the war. He was very interested in wining and dining. He had put out the word that he wanted, there was a particular Rhine wine he would like to taste. It was, I think, 1923. I'm not positive the vintage. At any rate, in that town we had like nine or 10 caves that they stored wine in that were under our control. And one day Pat came up and we were sitting in this great big beautiful ballroom, you know, and the antique chairs. And between the front door, the entryway of this huge home, and the ballroom were 2 steps. You step down. And the Jeep driver came running in the front door waving this bottle. He says, Pat, I found a bottle of 1923, and stepped over these things, fell down and broke the bottle, so he never got to drink. But it was fun. It was really enjoyable being out of the foxhole, free of everything. And we did have problems, of course, because we were undernourished. I don't think in that last month or so we got more than 1K ration a day. You know, the Jeeps would bring up ammunition, and if there was room, they'd bring rations. So we very seldom got rations. And we were very undernourished, I think. Pat, I think the first time we got into a place where we had a scale was, I think, in Rudesheim, shortly after we left the Forbach area. And we gloried in a bath for the first time in weeks or months. And Pat, I think, weighed 97 pounds and I weighed 94. And we ate like pigs, I think, for a while, trying to catch up a little bit.
The end of the war. Where were you when you finally heard that the Germans have surrendered?
The headquarters at that time tried to keep the troops busy. You know, they tried to keep us out of trouble by having a lot of duties and so forth. They had a lot of sports and they had a lot of activities and that sort of thing. Well, one of the things they put out was a radio school. And I thought, well, that's interesting. I'll go bone up on my code, because I hadn't taken code since I went through code training back in Fort McClellan. So I signed up for this radio school, more to keep out of guard duty than anything else. But anyway, I got up this little German town. I remember this castle name, but anyway, for this radio school, and I walked in, and there was a corporal there, and I said, "Sergeant, you're in charge." Well, it turned out that somebody had slipped up, and they had not arranged anything. I thought I was going to be a student. It turned out I was the only guy that knew code, so I was the instructor. And all these guys who were trying to get out of guard duty had shown up for this stupid school, you know. Well, it was kind of interesting, because among the guys that signed up were 2 fellows that came up in half-tracks, and they were TD outfit, I believe it was. I'm not positive. Anyway, half-tracks? Well, at any rate, it was a treaded vehicle. I can't remember what it was now. But at any rate, we had this course which lasted something like 2 weeks, and I taught them a little bit of code, what little I could remember, because I never got beyond 50 words per minute myself. And so I had some stuff that the Signal Corps provided for us for training, and gave them enough code that they learned the basic alphabet. And then, in order to keep them, to sharpen their stuff, we would sit down at a big table. There were only about 15 or 16 of us, I don't remember how many now. We'd sit down at this great big table with a radio, and we'd listen to the press wireless. The press wireless was going at about 60 words a minute. And this was the news being transmitted around to all the newspapers and news media back in those days. And the object was to write down on the paper everything you got, but if you did not get it, you would put a dash. Well, then after we'd done this for 15 minutes, and we'd start out with fresh piece of paper, and we'd continue. That was our practice. After it was over, then we'd take all these papers and see if we could make sense out of them. Well, it was all in clear text, so if you got a T, a dash, and an E from 16 papers, you knew it meant the, okay? And by that means, we were able to get the news, and we got the news sitting around this table of the war in Japan being over. And
Or the war in Europe. Or
I'm sorry, this is the war in Japan. This
Okay.
is VJ Day.
Okay.
Okay, VJ Day that's
Yeah.
this occurred. So we got a chance to find out before anybody else got it, because we got it in the press wireless before they got it in the newspapers.
Okay.
VE, now I got to stop and think about that one. The VE. I really honestly do not understand. Oh, yes, I do. Okay, all right. Strange that I don't remember that particular day. I do remember, and there's just still another thing. The little town along the Rhine River, I do remember the morning that we fell out for reveille in the morning, and it turned out that all the officers had been to a party and they were all hungover and didn't show up. So they, Pat, the first sergeant, was the one that held reveille and made the announcement that President Roosevelt had died. I do remember that occasion. In fact, I got a picture of that because it turned out one of the guys had, just before he fell in, said, may I get out of formation long enough to take a picture? And I said, yeah, if you don't let anybody see you. So at the time that we were all lined up on this company street out in the middle of this German village, he had stepped out of line and he took a picture of the company with and unfortunately the picture got smashed some fashion. So Pat is in a crinkle. You can't see Pat standing out in front of us, but you can see all the rest of the company. I do not remember VE. That's strange. I just honestly do not remember what happened in the VE, or I don't remember the occasion.
Now, I'm going to jump forward a bit. You're at the radio class. You guys figured out that the World War II was over, VJ Day.
Yeah.
Did class end?
Oh. No, I think we finished up. I don't remember what day of the week it was, but I think we went through that following Friday and then all reported back to our organizations.